This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I invited Gautam Sen to discuss a critical thing today. Why is India failing to really compete with China, whether in the export import gap, whether it's in infrastructure? India is really rapidly building all of these things. It's building its exports also, but there is something missing. What is that missing thing? We'll discuss with Gautam Sen. Dr. Sen, thanks for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Sen, one of the things that is very stark, and you and I have discussed this, which seems to be one of the key underlying reasons why the gap between India and China is not closing. That is, the Chinese save much more than Indians do. Indians were at one point great savers in the world, but that seems to have come down considerably. At the moment, comparatively, the Chinese seem to save about a little more than 44%, whereas Indians are at about a little more than 30%. There is a nearly 14-15% gap. That seems to be key.
Well, actually, the Chinese saving ratio was even higher earlier. I think you're referring to more recent data. So their ratio was actually 50 plus. But we really don't know for sure what the real figures are because Chinese data is not trustworthy. And also the way the accounting is done is not always comparable with that of other countries. Now, with this kind of large saving, there is a huge amount available for investment. And China has invested, as we all know, from publicly available data and also just visiting, absolutely huge amounts of money have been invested in China, in bridges, in transportation of other kinds, cities, real estate. Absolutely astonishing. And I think it is unprecedented in human history for this level of spending in such a short span of time. Admittedly, a significant portion of this has been wasted. For example, this great bridge between Macau and Hong Kong, built at enormous cost, apparently is hardly used by about 4,000 vehicles a day. They were expecting thousands, tens of thousands. So there are many such examples of investment projects. And of course, the Three Gorges Dam and many dams. China, of course, has been run by party aparchitaks who are engineers. And that might explain their impulse towards constantly building. It's like the pharaohs and the pyramids. So they have spent a lot of money, much of it wasted, but it also allowed them to spend enormous amounts on science, technology, engineering, mathematics. There was a time when India was ahead of China in the global ranking for mathematics. The Chinese made a systematic effort to improve their ranking, and they have achieved it. The story goes that a Fields Medal winner of Chinese origin from Harvard went to China and saw the president and said, "We can overtake the world." And they made facilities and funding available to him to build this. There are apocryphal stories of some of the great minds from China who were abroad. In the United States, in Cambridge, who went back to China and revolutionized Chinese science. There's one story I hear about a Chinese scientist at Cambridge, and he has done revolutionary work, I think, in an IT-related computing field. Cambridge University asked him to name his salary and offered him his own laboratory. He declined and went back. And he was asked, "Why did you come back?" He said, "In my school in China, my teacher told me, you must come back one day and serve your country." How moving and wonderful is that? And there are others from the United States. China has also been hunting the world. I was hearing the interview of a young Russian mathematician, young, very young, in her early 20s. And she had won some leading award in mathematics in Moscow. She was approached by a Chinese agent and invited to China. And she knew nothing about China, but she went because she was offered a huge salary. So this brilliant mathematician was instantly deployed for the advancement of China. So these are things which require money and focus, and they are doing it big time, which is why there are many, many fields in which China is ahead of most countries. They are competing very closely with the United States in quantum computing. They are somewhat ahead because of the enormous amounts of data they have collected in artificial intelligence.
And let's not forget in electric vehicles.
Electric vehicles, you can say, is the lower end of the science spectrum. We could live with not being so advanced in electric vehicles. Yes, they are about to destroy BMW and Mercedes in Europe simply because they are producing fine cars at much lower cost. But with quantum computing and artificial intelligence combined, everything will change. This will be the dawn of a new civilization, like the discovery of electricity, like the original hydraulic power of the early 19th and 18th centuries. This will be revolutionary, more than computing, more than aircraft engine. And the country which is ahead in this, combining these two technologies, will dominate the technologies of defense. For example, AI will allow you to target much more efficiently. So if you had a 60% accuracy, you will reach 95, 98%, which means your arsenal has gone up by 35%. You multiply this across the board. They are way ahead and they know what they're doing. So Chinese quantum computing and AI, because quantum computing does calculations in seconds, what would take 200 years for supercomputers today. So you can imagine the scale. There is a wonderful discussion of this by our distinguished Air Marshal G.S. Bedi, which I would recommend to your viewers to download and listen to. Air Marshal G.S. Bedi talks about quantum computing and would be interesting. Now, China is doing this, but this is not the whole story. Yes, they are far ahead. They have built millions of unoccupied homes, which is a waste of money. But this has an interesting and potentially significant downside for China. What the Chinese local authorities have been doing is they have been selling land at high prices to real estate developers who are then building virtual cities, multi-story buildings, and selling them at inflated prices. Now, this is the income which is a substantial part of the total revenue of local government. And those have been sold to Chinese consumers at inflated prices. Those prices have now collapsed across the board, 30, 40, 50, 60%. It has bankrupted many Chinese people. They have lost their life savings. So that's a problem. And they are still liable for the debt.
We're
Many
saying
of them
two
are saying,
things.
I wish.
We're saying two things, Dr. Sen. One is that China is leaps and bounds ahead in investing in various things, quantum computing being at the very cutting edge of this kind of investment. Prodigious mathematical output is another. EVs is one more, slightly down the spectrum in technology. Of course, we know about the infrastructure investment, and they're able to do all this because their household savings rate is still so high. India cannot catch up because of this big gap. Now, what has happened in India also, India is to be a big saver too, a big saving country too. That saving rate has consistently fallen. Before we go and talk a little more about what else China is doing, perhaps you could reflect on why India's saving rate is consistently falling. And one of the worries really is that our consumption rate and our consumption to savings rate ratio is becoming slightly precarious.
Well, these are complicated questions. Partly, Indian savings were a bit high. They were more in their mid-30s. And significant portion of the savings would come from government. So if government spending is disproportionately being devoted to consumption, that will lower the savings rate. So this is related with our politics. The way welfare spending and other forms of spending are a significant part, whether it is subsidized fertilizer or procurement of cereals. All of this will lower the savings rate because we are spending on all these other things. But it is improving. And actually, the Modi government has achieved quite a feat of somehow balancing infrastructure spending, which has grown, with greater spending on welfare, which, up to 1914, this was very dismal. The spending on infrastructure had really fallen in the decade before 2014. So now the reason why I talked about real estate is, these are instances of forced savings in China. This is a form of forced saving. Chinese people do save. Absolutely, it's an old tradition, a bit like India's, but a lot of it is to do with forced saving by the government, which is ambitious to grow the economy, very Soviet-style idea. The Russians had huge savings as well in the planned period. There's to deprive people of consumption, put it in savings and building the economy. And there comes a moment when the returns cumulatively begin to decline. And I think in a way, China has reached that point. But the real problem with China is this. Forced savings mean people have less for consumption. China's demographics indicate people are not marrying and people are not having children. The state is making huge efforts to promote marriage and childbirth. It has really collapsed. I won't quote you the figures because they seem to change every 2 years. And the reason for that is much of the population got priced out of the housing market because of the high cost and the indirect taxation of selling land at high cost to developers. This was a kind of forced saving. And in China, most women will say, no house, no wife. You cannot get married if you don't own a home in China. And a large number of women are saying, I'd rather not get married at all. I'd rather not have children at all. Life is so expensive now that I can't manage even if we have 2 salaries. Now, this has got to do with the savings rate because you have squeezed consumption. So this is a kind of backlash. And for this, China is paying a heavy price because the demographic collapse means that in a few years, the number of producers compared to the number of retired will be much lower. So few producers will have to be paying for a larger number of retired people. This is a standard phenomenon happening even in the United Kingdom, Italy, Russia, Japan, all of the world. India is in that very unique position where we have this population bulge of the young. So we don't yet, but in 30 years' time, we also will face this problem of many more older people than young people. So China is facing that now. Chinese data on population size is very suspect. One researcher who does a podcast every week, every other day, suggests that in a decade, China's population may fall to 800 million. Such is the crisis. Now that is an issue. That will be a serious issue. In addition, China's growth rate figures are not reliable. Even the official data is inconsistent with different parameters. So in a way, the savings ratio of China has led them into this crisis of a wider nature because you have basically thwarted the market in some dimension in order to achieve your goals, which are essentially political goals of high growth and militarization. This is the party's view of China's place in the world, and the ordinary person through the marketplace has reacted to this squeeze. So a high savings ratio may be okay for a short period of time, but if it's sustained, it has other negative consequences. And my feeling about China is there are now issues which cannot be resolved easily. The demographics cannot be altered, even if many more people marry and Chinese start having 3 children, which is very rare now. This will not happen. It is very costly now to have a child in China. The Chinese government is trying in many places to offer privileges to people who have children, low-cost childcare, but it is still very expensive. So they have a
Play
problem.
devil's advocate, Gautam Sen. Let me play devil's advocate and ask you. It is true that one of the advantages that India has is this demographic dividend. But this number one, as many people often point out, the demographic dividend isn't only about numbers; it's also about quality. If that demographics produces not high quality output, and if the productivity is low, then perhaps it's not as high quality a dividend as many people would think. That's number one. Number two, some people might argue that yes, China's population might indeed fall to 800 million, but because of by the time it hits the level, because of the investments they're making in things like quantum, technology and AI, the productivity level per capita in China will rise to such a phenomenal level that will mitigate the damage caused by the fallen sheer population.
Yes, but I think it'll have to be on a substantial scale. And they're also investing in robotics. They're investing a lot of effort in robotics to substitute. That's a possibility. That will be something very new. Maybe other societies will also be obliged to employ robots. And in a way, technology is increasing productivity on many levels already. That people are much more productive. They can deliver much more with information technology. So that is in a way a generalized phenomenon. Question is how strong that becomes. In the Indian case, this of course is our Achilles heel in India, low productivity. And this is something which our mutual friend Mr. Sabarwal talks about very eloquently, that our problem is not employment levels really. Ultimately, it's about low productivity because that is what dictates your income level. So to solve that, we need much better vocational training. We need much better schooling, which actually is there in parts of India, particularly in the south, in Tamil Nadu, in Andhra Pradesh, but much weaker as we go north of the Vindhyas, much weaker in all of the states, whether it's Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, UP. Efforts are being made, but this is a grave weakness that China does not have. China's high quality labor force and the sheer size of their production facilities means individual workers are much more productive, which is why Chinese were much more cost effective than we have been able to become even today. And that is something even Vietnam is offering much more than India, that they are much more productive. And ultimately, this depends truly on the quality and level of education, vocational training, professionalization. And I'm afraid we are not doing enough in this field. This will be the great problem for the future, and we need to devote a great deal of thoughtful attention to improving this.
Before we end, Dr. Sen, the savings gap, let's come back to where we began from the savings gap. This gap is not going to close in a hurry. The chances of India out investing China, in a sense, are questionable. Of course, India must continue to build infrastructure at a very rapid pace, which it already is. It must continue to invest in technology, which it already is. The GCCs, the number of GCCs being built in India is a good sign. The world trusts India to bring its R&D and base it in the country. All of these are good signs. But do you think it will be enough to close this basic gap that even if lots of Chinese investment go wrong, the Macau Bridge doesn't deliver, ghost cities of apartments exist, even if all of this happens, the gap is just too big?
If India continues to grow at a steady pace of nearly 8%, 7.5%, 8%, an economy triples in 14 years. So provided we are approaching 8%, and that's possible. Also, the savings gap can be compensated partly by foreign investment. So that is not an insuperable problem. My feeling is that, as India grows wealthier and the number of middle class grows from 200 million to 400 million, people will save more. Look at the number of middle class people who've now entered the equity market. They are now parking their savings. So the question is how effectively these savings are deployed. Now, I think the market is a better judge of how best to deploy them. And in China, political decisions have not given them the real dividends from the amount of savings they've had. And our great strength is that we have small crises and problems at regular intervals because the market corrects and they don't accumulate to become a huge crisis, which is very painful to resolve. So the market is a great vehicle for making sure you don't dig a very deep hole from which it is very hard to climb out. I am not optimistic about China's future. I think the demographic issue is very serious, and they have also now invited a great deal of hostility from abroad, and the export markets, say in India, are not so open anymore. And they're facing a similar kind of backlash from the United States and partly Europe. Now, China is still too important a producer to be shut out completely. But I don't think Russia will adequately compensate for the loss of market elsewhere. Now, the people who will pay the price in China will be the ordinary people. It is their standard of living and their consumption levels which will be squeezed, and basically the use of force keeps them down. The Chinese regime is able to control the population by use of force. So ordinary people in China can take a lot of punishment, no matter how much things go wrong, but that there is a limit to even that. There is a limit. And China has an old tradition of revolts, particularly peasant revolts. See? So things may indeed get out of hand. Also, if you look at the number of people who are standing outside banks going mad, and many, many Chinese banks are now virtually bankrupt because interest rates are very low and they can't cut their deposit rates. So they're making very little money. So all of these things will conspire, whereas in India, everything that goes wrong gets exposed very quickly. And the market intervenes to impose cost, but also reorientate investment and other decisions.
So two things then, Dr. Sen, two key takeaways, as they say, for India to compete and, save, compete against China and also improve its savings rate, and also, in a sense, going into the future, perhaps do better than China. One is we have to keep our demographics strong. So Indians have to keep having babies, essentially. And of course, we have to train them well. We have to teach them well, and better education, better vocational training, better training at every level must be provided so that this gap, which of course you correctly pointed out, even Vietnam has a higher productivity level. That productivity gap, you referred to Manish Tabarwal, who talks about this frequently and who runs a big labor company, must be fulfilled. Thanks very much, Gautam Sen, for your time.
I will just
and
add
your
three
comments.
quick points to summarize.
Please.
Points. One area where we still have a way to go is efficient markets.
Yes.
Efficient markets depend on the wider policy framework and its functioning. So we have still a long way to go. Secondly, as you said, and we agree, training and professionalization across the board, perhaps targeted in some areas. And the third thing I will add, because of my professional background, we must continue to invest in defense as we are doing, because we are a very vulnerable country. And we don't want to be derailed by this exogenous factor because we haven't spent enough in defense. And it's much better to spend now and avoid war than to spend after you start a war.
We leave it at that. Gautam Singh, thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it.